Due to his devilish acts and unique design, Kuja remains one of the most recognizable and memorable antagonists to have ever graced the Final Fantasy franchise. Serving as one of the main threats throughout Final Fantasy IX, Kuja was persistent, and as the narrative developed, his appearances were often pivotal, used to provoke an emotional response from both the in-game cast of characters, but also the player. From the slaying of Garnet's only parental figure and decimation of the Alexandrian fleet, through to the crushing finale where we saw the immeasurable weight lifted from his shoulders, each instance served as a literal manifestation of the game's overarching theme of returning to our roots, but not in an obvious manner. It's true that the creators wanted to craft an experience that would feel nostalgic to players, and they would achieve this by featuring numerous allusions and Easter eggs that could be enjoyed by those who had played prior games in the franchise. They also wanted to recreate the feelings and the rush they felt when developing the original Final Fantasy games. But outside of that, they also wanted to create a narrative that focused on returning to the roots of what it really meant to be human. This would highlight what role circumstance plays in the lives that we live, how it changes the consideration we might have for others, and how kindness and hatred might manifest as a result. These notions permeated through the playable cast of characters. Zidane, Vivi, and Garnet each benefited from circumstance, and this not only created favour, but gave them more optimism and lives ripe with opportunity. Kuja was then designed to show how circumstance could lead to even the purest of souls becoming twisted, ruled by pain, anger, and hatred, and driven to commit unspeakable acts. Throughout this video, which was recommended for creation by one of our top tier Patreon supporters called October 1917, we will explore how this came to pass, and we encourage you to stick with us until the end as we analyse the very essence of Kuja as a character. 5,000 years before the main events of Final Fantasy IX, Terran civilization was on the brink of collapse. Their crystal was failing, and unless a new, much stronger crystal could be found, their world and everything they held dear would perish. But this was not an unknown phenomenon. Their crystal's lifespan had expired numerous times before. In each prior instance, the Terrans were able to find a juvenile planet with no sentient life. This would then be assimilated and used to prolong the life of their crystal, and by proxy their planet and entire ecosystem. Just as they had before, the Terrans created a life form who would search for a suitable planet and oversee the assimilation. This life form was called Garland, and after the final Terran had entered into stasis to reserve their energy and reduce the demands on the crystal, the search for a suitable planet began. But after much searching, no suitable planets could be found. This created a conundrum for Garland, and with the light of the crystal continuing to weaken, decisive action needed to be taken to avoid the extinction of Terra. Widening the search criteria, Garland found a more developed planet called Gaia. This housed sentient life, and consequently a stronger crystal. But the belief was that the Terran crystal would still be able to overpower, absorb, and ultimately fuse with the Gaian crystal. After the preparations were complete, Garland initiated the fusion, but he was left dismayed as the Gaian crystal rejected the process, and both planets ended up being ravaged. Terra ended up being warped inside Gaia, and numerous Terran structures ended up on the planet's surface. Gaia also ended up having 2 moons, and a portal between the 2 worlds was formed. It was a disastrous turn of events, but Garland was not defeated. His objective could still be accomplished. It would just take patience, thousands of years worth of patience. His initial step was to transfer the Terran ether tree to Gaia, so that its roots could spread across the planet, stabilizing it and preventing any further damage. Garland then inserted the soul cage. This would disrupt the flow of souls through the Gaian crystal by discarding Gaian souls and replacing them with Terran ones. Those discarded Gaian souls were transformed into mist, which was then distributed across Gaia through the ether tree's now very ingrained roots. And when breathed in by the Gaian populace, this mist would lead to more aggressive behaviours and an increase in the number of conflicts, thus speeding up the process as the rate of death across the world would increase. It was a masterful plan, but Garland had not foreseen the ingenuity of the Gaian inhabitants, specifically those who resided in Lindblum. They learned to harness the mist, using it as a source of fuel, and this not only decreased the density of mist across the world, but also reduced the volume of conflicts that were happening. Frustrated, Garland chose to be much more direct. In 1776, he created his first Angel of Death, a genome that he named Kuja. Kuja's objective was simple: visit Gaia and incite conflict so as to increase the flow of souls once again. But due to the simplicity of the plan, Garland made a terrible mistake. Frustrated, the patience Garland had housed for so long dissipated, and in his petulance, he created Kuja fully formed as a 24-year-old man with strong convictions and a juvenile emotional disposition. It left Kuja exposed to emotions like anger and jealousy, but he was given an inability to feel any remorse or shame for his actions. Garland did this because he believed this would give him the necessary tools to do the job. He needed someone who would enjoy bringing about death and destruction, but what he failed to realize was that despite being developed in a physical sense, Kuja's lack of emotional maturity prevented him from harnessing his true power. When Garland realized the mistake he had made, he wrote Kuja off as a failure, limiting his lifespan before creating a second Angel of Death. But he never shared this information with Kuja, at least not in a direct capacity. When this second Angel of Death came into existence, the very traits Garland handpicked were turned inwards. Kuja felt threatened, and he felt disposable. And due to his inability to process emotions, he took the only course of action that made sense in that moment, kidnapping the new genome and abandoning it on Gaia. Upon finding out what had transpired, Garland was outraged. Not only would this act prolong his overriding objective of restoring Terra, but now he would need to continue using Kuja until a third Angel of Death could be created. Garland also felt it necessary to punish Kuja for his transgression, and so he chose to banish his minion from Terra, forcing him to reside on Gaia. Kuja failed to understand why he had been punished. From his perspective, he had behaved in the exact manner that was expected of him, and Garland had used a heavy hand. This led to feelings of resentment forming for what Kuja felt was unfair treatment. In the interim, this meant that Kuja, on the surface at least, appeared happy to continue serving as Garland's minion, infiltrating Gaian civilizations and taking a more proactive role in bringing about its demise where required. But due to those feelings festering deep within, Kuja only did so in order to learn so that he might one day find the means to overthrow his master. In the years that followed, Kuja made his home in the desert of the outer continent and made frequent visits to Trino, where he posed as a nobleman in order to gather intelligence and build a reputation. He also took an active role in the destruction of mundane Sari, and this turned out to be a critical initiative, as for the first time, Kuja realized Garland had shown his hand. As time had passed, Garland had become less and less patient. He'd also become more fearful of anything that might interfere with his plans. By ordering the destruction of mundane Sari, Kuja realized that Garland was threatened by the power of the summoners, and after learning about the eidolon known as Alexander, Kuja began to search for the crystal shards that had been scattered throughout the land, as he hoped to be able to harness its destructive power to usurp Garland. In 1799, this saw Kuja start to become more active. Working under the notion of his original objective, Kuja used his accrued influence to manipulate Queen Brahne. Despite being long-standing allies, Kuja convinced Brahne that with his assistance, she could conquer Burmecia and Lindblom. This would incite a huge conflict, leading to mass death, and this would have pleased Garland no end. But Kuja's true motivation was to acquire the crystal shard of each nation and come one step closer to wielding the power of Alexander, which could then be used to defeat his master. As part of the negotiation with Brahne, Kuja agreed to serve as her arms dealer, and to uphold his end of the bargain, Kuja supplied her with black mages, genome-like entities created of the mist to be soulless, obedient, and dispensable. As this plan started to gain traction, Kuja also took advantage of a mistake by the Lindblom hierarchy. After many years of being reliant on mist-powered airships, Lindblom, thanks to the efforts of Sid Fabul IX and his engineer Zebold, had created the first steam-powered airship. Sid called it Hildegarde after his wife, but after becoming frustrated by his womanizing, Hilda stole the airship and ran away. Seeing the opportunity, Kuja acquired the Hildegarde and kidnapped Queen Hilda, and he did so with the hopes of using both to further his ambitions. Even though he had access to the entire world thanks to his silver dragon, the Hildegard, thanks to its ability to roam beyond the Mist Continent, could be used to transfer large quantities of supplies around the world. Kuja also chose to divulge his wider plan to Queen Hilda for both narcissistic pleasure, but also so that she could be released at the right time, manipulating events in his favour. The following year, Kuja took an active role in the Battle of Bermessia, and thanks to his influence, it was a bloodbath. Bolstered by their contingent of black mages, Alexandrian forces took Bermessia by complete surprise, and they showed no mercy. Hapless soldiers were slaughtered, and the black mages displayed no notion of chivalry, massacring citizens who had taken up no active role in the conflict and were just looking to escape the nightmare that had descended upon them. In the aftermath, Kuja convinced Brahne to extract the eidolons housed within her daughter, and one of the eidolons, Odin, was used to decimate Clara, allowing them to acquire one of the crystal shards. Another eidolon, Atmos, was then used to lay siege to Limblum, weakening its defences so that the black mages could again be used to force the once great kingdom into complete submission. Both of these battles were bloody and brutal, and many Gaians were slain. And with many Gaians slain, Kuja continued to show loyalty to his master, at least on the surface. But with numerous obstacles now removed, and with the eidolons now much more accessible due to his manipulation of Brahne, Kuja decided to step up his plans. And in that regard, he couldn't have hoped for more fortune. Exuding confidence due to her recent victories, Brahne decided that Kuja's services were no longer required. It proved a fatal move. Brahne summoned Bahamut to dispose of her former partner, thinking he would be blown away by its raw power. But she was stunned when Kuja turned the tides, using the Invincible, a Terran airship, to enslave Bahamut before then ordering it to decimate the Alexandrian fleet and slay its reigning monarch. Looking to accomplish his ultimate goal by procuring the power of Alexander, Kuja then turned his attentions to the kingdom itself. Now wielding the power of Bahamut, Kuja laid siege to Alexandria. Alexander was then summoned in its defense, just as he had anticipated, but when Kuja attempted to enslave the eidolon, Garland appeared. Due to his lack of emotional control, Kuja had become far too confident and brazen. Although his plan may have been quite nuanced and subtle at the beginning, after it started to gather steam, it had become as subtle as a brick. Garland had been watching with intrigue as it developed, but the attempted enslaving of Alexander was a step too far by his minion, and he chose to take direct action. Kuja watched on as Garland destroyed Alexander in an extreme show of force meant to assert his dominance. But instead of deterring Kuja, it spurred him on. It's true that years of planning had been wiped out in an instant, but as Kuja returned to his desert palace, his resolve was cemented. He now only had one objective: to find an even more powerful eidolon than Alexander and continue the fight against Garland, no matter the cost. Realizing that he could no longer act in such a visible manner, as the eyes of Garland would be watching with much more tenacity, Kuja decided to revert back to manipulative tactics. And this time, the object of his affections was Zidane. Desperate to seek revenge, Zidane and his allies had been attempting to hunt Kuja down, and they made good progress, but their enthusiasm led to carelessness, and they were captured. Using Zidane's allies as leverage, Kuja tasked him with obtaining the Gulag Stone. And this would serve two objectives. One, he'd obtain a powerful artifact, and two, he could dispose of Zidane's troublesome allies while he was preoccupied. It seemed foolproof enough, but Kuja underestimated Zidane, and he was unable to follow through with the second part of his plan before he returned. It left Kuja in a compromised position, and he realized the only way out was to abandon his hideout. Kuja also realized that due to how much he had been exposed, the next part of his plan would need to be carried out with great haste. And it was with this notion very much at the front of his mind that Kuja took swift and decisive action, kidnapping Aiko and heading straight for Mount Gulag. Impressed by the power of the eidolons housed within Garnet, Kuja realized that Aiko could house similar treasures, and after arriving at Mount Gulag, he ordered Zorn and Thorn to perform the extraction ritual. But unlike Garnet, Aiko was too young for the ritual to be performed, and after it failed, her pet Moogle, known as Mog, utilized the power of trance to transform into the eidolon Medine and destroy the Jesters. This was quite the surprise, but it was a welcome one for Kuja. For so long he had been focused on attempting to acquire a power capable of defeating Garland. He believed eidolons were that power, but after witnessing the might of trance, Kuja began researching how he himself might be able to enhance his own abilities in a similar manner. Kuja searched far and wide for the answer, but he soon realized the solution had been right in front of him the whole time. As a genome, Kuja could absorb dormant souls that had lingered upon death, and this meant he could use their emotions in the absence of his own. He just needed to wait for the perfect opportunity to arise, and it did so not too long after, as when Zidane found a way to create a connection between Gaia and Terra, Kuja followed. Watching from the shadows, Kuja waited until Garland was vulnerable, and then he struck. Garland was weakened following an exchange by Zidane, and Kuja used the souls that had been sucked up by the Invincible, including that of Queen Brahne. This act allowed him to enter into a powerful trance, and with Garland defeated, Kuja declared himself ruler of Gaia and Terra. It was a bold move, but for all of Kuja's physical strength, he was still emotionally immature. And when he learnt the truth about his existence from Garland, that he was never anything more than a disposable pawn, just like the black mages Kuja had created himself, he became enraged. Kuja proclaimed that he would destroy the world, and after succeeding with the destruction of Terra, he retreated to the Crystal World. Inside, still fueled by rage, Kuja attempted to defeat Zidane, but his powers were not enough. And as a final throw of the dice, Kuja cast Ultima, hoping to take as many people with him as possible on his one-way trip to the land of the dead. Realizing that this too had failed, Kuja was left despondent, and such was his pain that Necron was summoned to end all life and save it from the suffering of existence. But as Necron was defeated, Kuja realized what it meant to live, and even though he could no longer save himself, he at least wanted to allow other people to live instead. Acting on that sentiment, Kuja teleported Zidane and his allies out of the Eva Tree before they were consumed by it. It was meant to be a final act of redemption, but Kuja was surprised and happy to learn that Zidane had returned to try and save him, even though he knew it was a futile act, as his life was about to end. And that concludes the story of Kuja, one of the main antagonists from Final Fantasy IX. Throughout the majority of the experience, Kuja was positioned as an antagonist who was difficult to sympathize with. He displayed no remorse for his actions, and his motivations were very self-centered. But it was only once you understood why that you could see how Kuja was used by the scenario writers in conjunction with Zidane to highlight the power of circumstance and the power of empathy. Both characters were designed as angels of death by Garland, with the objective of sowing the seeds of war and bringing about mass death across Gaia. But had Kuja not taken the decision to kidnap Zidane and abandon him on Gaia, then there's a good chance Zidane would have followed the same path laid out by his older brother, becoming indoctrinated to the whims of Garland and carrying out his bidding with much more efficiency. It's where the sympathy for Kuja comes in, as he was doomed to fail. Garland made him ill-equipped to process much of what happened to him, and it's unsurprising that Kuja lashed out in the way he did, as it was similar to how a child would behave. Many young children become jealous of their siblings if they perceive them to be receiving more attention. It can lead to them lashing out due to their inability to rationalize and channel those negative emotions, and that is exactly what Kuja did. He sought revenge against the individual destined to replace him without any thought or consideration for the consequences. As those feelings developed and found a vessel to become amplified, Kuja was consumed. But as they subsided and Zidane was able to calm the demon inside, we got to see that Kuja had the potential to be someone else. And his legacy was that he showed the other genomes created by Garland that they could be something else too, that they could defy their fate and become their own people, just as Kuja had done himself. And I think that was a nice sentiment to round out Kuja's story. But yeah, with that small analysis out of the way, that marks the end of this Final Fantasy IX Origins video. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do hit that like button, share the video around with all the people you know who love Final Fantasy IX, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our channel. Also, be sure to let us know what Kuja means to you as a character in the comments. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. A big thanks to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, and of course, a big thanks to all of you for joining me on this deep dive into the lore of Final Fantasy IX. I hope to see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.